Well, so the U.S.-China relationship obviously has two sides, right? So up until now, we've talked about the Chinese side. I'd love to talk a little bit about an article that you recently published with Dr. Sun on the U.S. side. And of course, the United States and China have very different systems. They have state propaganda. We do not. But we do have members of Congress that are able to express their views. And you've found that there's been an area of rare bipartisan agreement on the Hill towards a more contentious, or I should say, competing and countering China. What are some of the themes that you've identified in some of those messages out of members of Congress?
Thank you for bringing up that project as well. Yes, so that's a project that I recently published as an academic article based on my and my co-authors' analysis of U.S. legislation on China over the last 10 years and senators' tweets about China. So we look at the messaging and the legislation and look at how that's changed. And there, just like on the Chinese side, I see that around 2018, 2019, the messaging got a lot harsher, got a lot sharper. What I see happening is that both Democrats and Republicans became more convinced that China is a near peer competitor with intent to outcompete the United States. So several developments in that time period, the US noticing that China's 5G is very advanced, the US having reports that China's IP theft far exceeds what we thought. They convinced people, they convinced senators and likely the US population, if you look at some surveys, they convinced people that China seeks to displace or outcompete the United States, and it has the capacity to do so. And so that leads people to a kind of place where polarization matters less. And so even though there might be disagreements about what needs to be done about this problem, there is a bipartisan consensus on this problem now. And that has led to new bipartisan support for legislation in the US, legislation that's aimed at outcompeting and countering China. And so I see the rise of that around the same time you see China's anti-American messaging rising at home. So you're absolutely right. There are two sides to this. And even though they're not the same, of course, both sides feel challenged and even threatened by the other.
And so these words have been connected with actions, as you mentioned, that there's been new legislation, new policy out of the administration over the last 5 years or so. Can you just sort of give us a little bit of a taste of what some of those actions are?
Sure. So I look specifically in the article at legislation on China and how it has changed. And what you see is that legislation on China can be divided into making a statement legislation that condemns China for something, but it doesn't do more than that, and then legislation that demands action, that mandates government action that's sometimes costly, very costly, to compete with China or punish China for a certain offense. And legislation like that in that second category has boomed since 2019. A major example, of course, is the CHIPS Act. Now, the CHIPS Act is $280 billion, and it has a lot of moving parts, but it very much is centered on the idea of the US being in competition with somebody, right? And obviously that somebody is the PRC. And therefore, the US needs to make advances in new technologies and new investments and work better with allies to counter China's geopolitical moves. And so that kind of legislation receiving at least some bipartisan support, I think it got 25% of legislators in both houses, in both parties of both houses to support it, both chambers of Congress to support it. That kind of bipartisanship wasn't happening just 5 years before that. And so you see a change in the kinds of legislation, and then you see a change in how bipartisan they are. And together, those things mean that, China can no longer rely on the administration changing and that changing China policy that much. a lot of Chinese interlocutors and observers of the United States were surprised that Joe Biden, coming into the presidency, didn't erase the Trump policies. Joe Biden was supposed to get rid of the Trump sanctions on China, which he had previously criticized, but then he mostly didn't do that. And Biden has been in some ways just as tough or tougher on China than Trump. And so now you have this bipartisan consensus, even though Republicans may be louder about China being a challenger in terms of the number of tweets or something. There is a pretty large consensus that China is a near peer competitor, and it's very aggressive in its actions now around the globe. And so the U.S. needs to legislate in this way, and it needs to move fast.
Well, that's very interesting. And maybe just one last question, if I may, and I think probably our most important question is sort of how do we go forward? So we, not to suggest at all any sort of moral equivalency between the two, but China's taken a tougher line than the United States. The United States has taken a tougher line on China. How do we put a floor under this very important relationship? And what is your prognosis for the U.S.-China relationship going forward, and how to potentially improve it?
I think that even though things are going poorly, it doesn't mean we're spiraling towards conflict. I don't see us spiraling towards conflict. I see us having hit a new floor now, where now both sides have become cognizant of the challenge posed by the other in a new way, right? And that creates the dynamic we have now, but that in order to make it worse, it would take a kind of crisis. It would still take a crisis for the US and China to get into real, heated conflict. So I'm not, immediately worried that we're spiraling. This doesn't sound like the US and Iraq right before the US invasion of Iraq, right? And thank goodness. But that doesn't mean things are going to get better. And, in order for things to get better, these perceptions have to change. But it's hard to see how perceptions can change when it's not one issue that's causing the perceptions on both sides. It's a whole range of issues, right? Senators in the United States are not more fearful of China because of any one thing the PRC has done. They're fearful of China because of a whole range of things they see the PRC doing. And likewise, on China's side, the perception that the US is trying to contain China has seemingly solidified into a kind of conventional wisdom that's very hard to shake. And so even though we might be able to keep cooperating on climate change or on some issues, I don't really fundamentally see how things can improve, until there's a really big change in behavior by one of the two sides. So I'm unfortunately not that optimistic. I mean, I could suggest in my completely personal capacity or my view as a scholar, I could suggest that the two sides should work on establishing protocols to avoid conflict, to limit the scope of competition, to say, okay, we're competing, that's fine, but let's not compete beyond these bounds. And those are important now to set those bounds. It's important now to set those bounds because technology is changing and because the competition is moving into new areas and AI and outer space and things. So that would be good to prevent, to prevent future deterioration. But I have trouble seeing a way forward out of this basic framework of competition that we're in now.
Well, on that sobering note, I'm afraid that we are out of time. But we'll make sure to put some links to some of your work in the comments section below. And for those who want to learn more, thank you so much for joining us this morning or this evening for you in Washington, Chris. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Patrick. I appreciate it. Bye now.